1 Corinthians 12 is concerned with spiritual gifts, and particularly with the manifestation or the functions, you could say, of those gifts. Verse 1 reads, "Now about the gifts of the Spirit, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed." This is Paul writing. Verse 4 says, "There are different kinds of gifts, but the same Spirit distributes them. There are different kinds of service, but the same Lord. There are different kinds of working, but in all of them and in everyone, it is the same God at work." Verse 7, "Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for what? For the common good." So the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. The Spirit is manifest in the common good. That is what is good in common for the entire community. Therefore, when actions cannot be said to constitute good that is shared across boundaries of difference, they are not manifestations of God's Spirit. A bit further down in verse 12, there's a heading that precedes that verse. That heading reads in the NIV, "Unity and diversity in the body." Verse 12 reads, "Just as a body, though one, has many parts, but all its many parts form one body, so it is with Christ." Verse 18, "God has placed the parts in the body, every one of them, just as God wanted them to be. If they were all one part, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, but one body." Now, on the inaugural day of the church, the ecclesia, in the book of Acts, there were Jews from every nation. That word nation, representative of many ethnicities. If you remember when the miracle of languages took place, they heard these Galileans speaking in their own languages. So there were Jews from every nation that were gathered there. This was the inauguration of the church. This is how the church began, as a community of diversity. Yet today, the church in the United States, as Dr. King lamented many decades ago, is still very segregated. In fact, Dr. King said, and I quote, "It is appalling that the most segregated hour of Christian America is 11 o'clock on Sunday morning." The problem of racial division in this country is deeply systemic, with a protracted history of over 400 years. The very first slaves were brought to our shores in 1619. This deep structural evil can only be overcome by intentionally coming together. Dr. King said, quote, "Like life, racial understanding is not something that we find, but something that we must create. The ability of blacks and whites to work together, to understand each other, will not be found ready-made. It must be created by the fact of contact." End quote. Now, the problem of race in this country also goes beyond this white-black dichotomy. As my dear friend Dr. Racinos would say, race matters in more than black and white. There's a deep history of racism toward the Latinx community as well. This is a structural problem that is deeply embedded within our society. So what is the answer to this egregious evil? I believe Paul is getting at this when he's talking about the Spirit and the function of the gifts of the Spirit within the community. The final section of chapter 12 has this heading in the NIV. It says, "Love is indispensable." And it begins with this brief passage that leads into the subsequent chapter. It says, "And yet," Paul says, "I will show you the most excellent way." And then he goes on in chapter 13, very famous and familiar passage to you, to say that all the gifts of the Spirit essentially are meaningless without love. all these different gifts, whether they be prophecy or tongues or whatever, the list that he gives, they're absolutely meaningless without love. So genuine love across boundaries of difference is the authentic manifestation of the Spirit, and only genuine love will foster the legitimate common good of which Paul wrote. That common good that does not include some to the exclusion of others. Now, that manifestation of the Spirit for the common good must be exhibited in both love and praxis. Now, praxis is that circular traffic between reflection and action. So that means that the Spirit equips us to take action based on love. That is the function of the Spirit within the church and the world. Now, I want to encourage you with this psalm that I think is absolutely beautifully written and wonderfully illustrates this principle of love in action. I hope it encourages you today.